The sea was restless that night. Waves rolled like slumbering beasts beneath the hull of the storm reaver, whispering secrets only the wind could understand. The air carried the scent of salt and something else, something ancient, something forbidden. Captain Ronan Drake stood at the bow, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. His coat, heavy with years of storm and battle, clung to his broad shoulders as the cold breeze bit through the air. He had sailed these waters 100 times, but tonight they felt different. The ocean was waiting. Then he heard it. A song. Soft at first, like a whisper carried by the tide, weaving through the mist. It was not meant for human ears, yet it found him, wrapped around his soul like silk. His heartbeat slowed, his breath caught. The melody was not just sound, it was longing, a call from something unseen, something that knew his name before he even spoke it. A voice, smooth as moonlight on water, sang from the abyss. The crew murmured in fear, crossing themselves, gripping their weapons. Sirens, one whispered. They'll drag us down, Captain. But Roman did not fear the deep. He had spent his life dancing on the edge of death, and if the sea had come to claim him, he would not resist. With steady hands, he loosened his belt, shedding his weapons, his boots. And then he leaped. Cold surrounded him instantly, swallowing him whole. The world above faded, and the depths embraced him. Shadows moved in the water, flickers of silver and blue. The song grew louder, filling his chest, pulling him deeper. Then she appeared. She did not glide. She flowed, a vision carved from the ocean itself. Her skin shimmered in shades of blue, as if kissed by the moon and the tides alike. Her hair, long as the rolling waves, drifted in the water like threads of starlight. And her eyes, God's, her eyes, were silver storms, holding within them the weight of the sea's endless sorrow and its infinite wonders. Solara. Her name formed in his mind before she spoke it. She watched him as one watches a fire, curious, wary, drawn by something neither could name. Ronan could not breathe, and yet he did not drown. The weight of the world above was gone. There was only this moment, suspended between air and abyss. She reached for him, fingers brushing his chest, warm despite the water. A glow spread where she touched, a signal of swirling light searing into his skin, tying them together with a magic older than time itself. Yours, she whispered, though her lips never moved. Mine. Ronan did not understand, but he did not pull away. For the first time in his life, he was not chasing fortune, not fighting fate. He was simply lost in her. The sea stirred around them. The ocean had claimed him. And in its depths, he had found something far more dangerous than death. Desire. Ronan awoke to the soft caress of the tide against his skin. He was no longer in the crushing depths, but resting on a bed of smooth black rock, half submerged in a hidden cove where the sea whispered to the shore. Moonlight painted silver lines across the water, and a figure sat at the edge of the tide, watching him with quiet curiosity. Solara. She was close now, close enough that the scent of salt and something sweet, like crushed pearls and deep sea flowers, wrapped around him. The glow of her skin was softer in the open air, her silver eyes tracing the sigil that still burned against his chest. Why did you bring me here? His voice was rough, the weight of the sea still lingering in his lungs. Solara tilted her head, the motion impossibly graceful, like the tide shifting with an unseen pull. You did not belong to the depths, she murmured, her voice weaving through the air like mist curling over the waves. Not yet. Her fingers, delicate yet strong, reached out, hovering just above his heart. The sigil pulsed beneath her touch, as if recognizing its creator. Ronan felt its warmth, but more than that, he felt her. The sea between them, the pull of something neither of them fully understood. You marked me, he said, not accusing, just searching. Solara did not deny it. I have tied you to the ocean. A pause, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. And to me. Roman should have feared such words, but fear was a foreign thing in this moment. The pirate who had once feared no man now found himself undone by a whisper, by a touch lighter than the breeze. You are a danger to me, he admitted, though he did not move away. She smiled then, a small knowing curve of her lips, as if she had heard these words before, from men who thought themselves untouchable. And yet you came when I called. Ronan exhaled, closing his eyes for a brief moment. It was true. He had chased treasure his whole life, but nothing had ever pulled him like this. Like the tide dragging a ship from shore, like a storm carving paths through the sky. Solara moved closer, and the ocean moved with her. The tide kissed his legs as she knelt beside him, her hair cascading like liquid silver. Her presence was neither fire nor ice. It was something deeper, something that did not burn or freeze but swallowed. She traced the edge of his jaw with the back of her fingers, a whisper of touch that sent ripples through him, as if she were reading a story in his skin. The salt of the sea mingled with the heat of his breath, and for a moment, the world was silent, just the soft hum of the waves, the pulse of the ocean, and the space between them. "Why me?" he asked, voice barely more than a breath. Solara's expression softened as if she, too, was searching for the answer. Because the sea does not choose without reason. Ronan, the pirate who defied kings, who laughed in the face of storms, felt something shift inside him, a current unseen, pulling him into uncharted waters. Solara leaned closer, and in that moment, it was not the sea that threatened to drown him. It was her. The night stretched long, the sea humming in a rhythm only the two of them could hear. Roman sat on the smooth rock, his clothes damp, the salty breeze teasing his skin. Solara remained close, her presence like the whisper of the waves, gentle, yet unrelenting. Her silver eyes held him, studying, searching. It was as if she could see beyond flesh, beyond bone, into something deeper, something buried beneath years of salt and blood, conquest and loss. Roman had always been a man of war, but here, beneath her gaze, he felt unmade. Solara lifted her hand, hovering just above his skin. "The ocean does not forget," she murmured, her voice woven with the tide. "It remembers every soul that touches it." Ronan exhaled, his breath unsteady. "And what does it remember of me?" A small, knowing smile curved her lips. "That you are not afraid of it. But perhaps you should be." Her fingers traced over the sigil on his chest, the mark she had left upon him in the deep. It pulsed beneath her touch, a rhythm that matched the slow crash of the waves. The warmth of her fingers seeped into him, and he wondered if it was magic or something far more dangerous, something neither of them dared to name. He reached up, slow and careful, as if she might slip away like foam on the tide. His rough fingertips brushed against her cheek, finding her warm despite the coolness of her skin. She did not flinch, did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a brief moment, as if savoring something she had never known. "The sea has given you to me," Ronan whispered, his voice low, edged with something raw. Solara's eyes opened, filled with the storm of the ocean. "Or perhaps it has given you to me." The thought sent something deep through him, a current he could not fight. He had spent his life defying fate, carving his own path through battle and blood, yet here he was, caught in a force greater than any storm. The tide rose higher, lapping at their legs, as if urging them closer. Solara's breath was soft against his lips, her presence a weightless force pulling him in. Ronan had known many embraces, had stolen kisses in the dark corners of every port he had conquered, but this was different. This was not conquest. This was surrender. His lips brushed hers, a touch lighter than the ocean mist. It was the kind of touch that spoke in unspoken words, the kind that did not demand but rather offered. Solara did not resist. Instead, she met him with the patience of the sea, endless, knowing, inevitable. The world around them blurred, the crashing waves, the distant calls of gulls, the ship waiting in the mist. None of it mattered. There was only the pull between them, as natural as the tide meeting the shore. But the sea was never kind to lovers. A sudden wind howled across the cove, the waves surging higher as if the ocean itself had woken from its slumber. Solara pulled away, her eyes darkening like storm clouds. "They know," she whispered. Ronan frowned, his hand still against her cheek. "Who?" She turned toward the sea, where shadows moved beneath the surface, watching, waiting. "The ones who would never let me love a man of the land." And in that moment, Roman knew. The sea had given her to him, but it had never meant for him to keep her. The waves trembled as if the ocean itself had drawn a sharp breath. The wind whistled through the hidden cove, lifting Solara's silver hair like threads of moonlight. casting eerie shadows over the rocks. Ronan felt the shift in the air, the warning beneath the wind, the silent threat woven through the waves. Solara's gaze remained fixed on the water, where the darkness churned. Shapes moved beneath the surface, silhouettes of something ancient, something that did not belong to the gentler tides. "They have come," she murmured, her voice quiet, but laced with a sadness Ronan had never heard before. "Who?" His hand rested on the hilt of his dagger, but even as he said it, he knew steel would be useless against what lurked beneath. "The Watchers," she breathed. "The ones who guard the ocean's secrets, who do not forgive when its children stray too far." Ronan's jaw tightened. "You mean because of me?" Solara turned to him then, the silver in her eyes flickering like moonlight on restless water. "Because I have broken a vow older than time." Ronan had spent his life bending fate to his will, carving his name into the bones of the world. Yet now, standing before this woman who was more ocean than flesh, he felt small before the weight of something he did not understand. "Come with me," he said, the words raw, reckless, "to the land, to where the sea cannot take you from me." A storm of emotions passed through Solara's gaze, longing, sorrow, something close to hope. But hope was a dangerous thing where the ocean ruled. She lifted her hand, fingers tracing the roughness of his jaw, as if memorizing him before the tide pulled her away. The sea does not let go so easily. Ronan caught her wrist, his grip firm, desperate. "Neither do I." For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick as the mist curling over the waves. Solara's breath was the tide, steady yet fragile, as if the ocean itself held her tethered to this moment. Then, the water exploded. Dark shapes surged from the sea, their bodies twisting between shadow and foam, their eyes like hollow pearls reflecting no light. The Watchers, ancient beings neither mortal nor divine, bound to the ocean's will. They rose in unison, their forms shifting like waves caught between stillness and fury. Solara took a sharp step back, and Ronan saw it, the shimmer of her skin paling, the faint tremble in her breath. Fear. The tallest of the Watchers stepped forward, his form towering like a wave before a storm. His voice was the deep rumble of the abyss, a language of currents and crashing tides. "She is ours." Ronan's hand went to his sword, but Solara's fingers caught his wrist, shaking her head. "You cannot fight the sea." He swallowed hard, rage curling in his chest like a rising tide. Then what did they want? Solara turned to the Watchers, her chin lifting despite the sorrow in her gaze. "I have done no harm." The leader's hollow eyes narrowed. "You have forgotten your place." A wave crashed against the rocks, the spray like cold fingers clawing at Ronan's skin. The meaning was clear. Solara belonged to the sea, and the sea did not share. Ronan clenched his fists. "If she chooses to leave, will you stop her?" A silence followed. Then the Watcher's lips curled into something like a cruel smile. "She cannot leave what she is." Solara's breath hitched. The truth in their words cut deeper than any blade. Ronan saw it then, the war in her eyes. She was caught between two worlds, but the tide was stronger. And for the first time in his life, Roman Blackmore knew what it felt like to lose a battle before it had even begun. The night lay heavy over the cove, the sky stitched with stars that flickered like distant whispers. The ocean breathed against the shore, its song low, sorrowful, a melody only the two of them could hear. Roman and Solara stood at the edge of the world, where land and sea met in an embrace as fleeting as their own. Solara's silver gaze shimmered under the moonlight, her expression carved with longing and despair. The Watchers had returned to the deep, but their warning lingered in the air like salt on the wind. She was bound to the ocean, her fate tied to the tides. And yet Ronan's presence called her to something beyond the waves, something forbidden, something reckless. He stepped closer, his fingers ghosting over the curve of her cheek, the warmth of his touch a stark contrast to the coolness of her skin. "Say the word," he murmured, his voice rough, edged with desperation, "and I'll take you far from here, somewhere the sea cannot touch you." Her lips parted, the promise of an answer lingering on the cusp of her breath. But the ocean hummed behind her, a silent reminder that her heart did not belong to the land. She turned away, her gaze lost in the horizon. You do not understand, Roman. I am not only of the sea, I am the sea. His fingers curled into a fist at his side. Then let the sea break. Solara exhaled a soft, trembling laugh, though sorrow weighed it down. You are a man of war. You fight battles with steel and fire. But the ocean does not fight. It swallows. Ronan reached for her hand, his callous fingers wrapping around hers. Then let it swallow me too. Her breath hitched. The words were madness, but so was the way her heart ached for him. She had spent her life drifting with the tides, unshackled, untamed. And yet, in his arms, she had found something no current had ever carried her toward home. A single step closed the space between them, and her fingers traced the scar along his jaw, a mark left by a world far different from her own. His breath was warm, steady, and for the first time, she allowed herself to lean into it. The ocean roared as if in protest. Solara pressed a trembling hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath. If I stay, the sea will rage. It will not let me go so easily. Ronan tilted his head, his gaze locked onto hers, fierce as the storms he had sailed through. Then let it rage. And in that moment, with the wind whispering between them and the tide clawing at her feet, Solara made a choice. She pulled him down, her lips brushing against his like the first touch of a wave against the shore, soft, fleeting, and then all-consuming. The world melted away, the stars above them fading into the darkness of closed eyes and quiet sighs. But the sea did not forget. A sudden gust of wind howled through the cove, and a wave surged up the shore, its icy fingers lashing against them. Solara gasped as the water coiled around her ankles, pulling her, reminding her of the bond she had dared to defy. Ronan's grip tightened. No, he growled, defiance burning in his voice. Solara's heart pounded. She could feel it. The call of the deep, the anger of the tide. The ocean was coming for her, and it would not leave without a price. The sea howled like a wounded beast, its voice rising in fury as waves crashed against the cove's jagged rocks. Moonlight trembled upon the water's restless surface, casting silver veins across the tide. The ocean was awake. It had heard Solara's defiance, felt the warmth of her lips against Roman's, and now it raged with jealousy. Solara staggered back as the tide pulled at her, cold fingers laced with warning. She could feel the whispers beneath the waves, the voices of her kin calling her home. But her heart was no longer theirs to command. Roman tightened his grip around her wrist, his touch rough, desperate. His storm-blue eyes burned with the fire of a man unwilling to surrender. Fight it, he breathed, his words barely audible above the roaring wind. Stay with me. Her breath hitched. Could she? Could she truly break free from the sea's embrace? The thought of leaving the depths behind, of choosing a life where her tail would never again glide through the ocean's endless blue, sent a shiver of fear through her. And yet, here in Roman's arms, she had tasted something more powerful than any tide. Love. The sea knew it too. A monstrous wave surged forward, clawing up the shore, its water swirling around them in a furious embrace. Roman's footing slipped, and he stumbled as the ocean sought to pry them apart. Solara gasped as icy tendrils curled around her waist, pulling, demanding. Her people's voices grew louder, their calls filled with sorrow. You cannot forsake us. You cannot forsake the sea. Pain twisted in her chest. The ocean had been her cradle, her sanctuary. She had danced in its currents, sung with its creatures. It was all she had ever known. But then Ronan's hand found hers again, his fingers weaving through hers with an unshakable promise. He pulled her close, his breath warm against her temple. Solara, he whispered, his voice raw. Don't let it take you. Tears blurred her vision. The battle within her waged like a storm, love and duty, land and sea, the past and the future she longed for. She reached up, her fingertips grazing his jaw, memorizing the roughness of his skin, the heat of his presence. And then she made her choice. With all the strength in her soul, she turned to the sea, her voice rising above the chaos. I am not yours anymore. The ocean roared in fury. A wave exploded upward, towering over them like a vengeful god. Solara gasped as water engulfed her, dragging her under. Darkness swallowed her whole, the weight of the tide crushing, suffocating. Ronan's muffled cry pierced the depths as he reached for her, but the sea was unrelenting. It wrapped around her like an iron chain, pulling her deeper, deeper, back into the world she was trying to leave behind. Her lungs burned. Panic clawed at her chest. No, she would not be taken. Summoning every ounce of strength, she kicked against the current, twisting in the water's grip. The ocean snarled, but she fought harder, breaking free from its hold. Above her, the surface shimmered like a dream just out of reach, and then a strong hand plunged into the water. Ronan. Their fingers brushed, and in that instant, she knew he was her anchor. Not the sea, not the past, him. With one last desperate push, she surged upward, her hand locking onto his. And then she was breaking the surface, gasping for air, collapsing into his arms. The ocean screamed behind them, retreating wounded. Solara clung to Ronan, her body trembling, her heart pounding in time with his. She had done it. She had chosen him. But the sea would not forget, and it would not forgive. The sea had been denied. Its fury echoed in the crashing waves, the tide boiling beneath a sky thick with storm clouds. The ocean did not take kindly to betrayal, and Solara had defied it in the most unforgivable way. She had chosen love over the depths, the warmth of a man's arms over the call of the water. Ronan held her close, his chest rising and falling in unsteady breaths. His arms, strong and sure, wrapped around her as if he could shield her from the wrath of the ocean itself. He had fought battles, faced storms, conquered men, but nothing had ever felt as terrifying as the thought of losing her. Solara trembled against him, her silver hair clinging to her damp skin, her breath ragged. The weight of her choice pressed heavy upon her, but she did not regret it. "I am with you," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. Ronan cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek, his gaze searching hers. "And I will fight whatever comes for you." But the sea was not done. A sudden gust of wind howled through the cove, and the waves surged forward, hungrily clawing at the shore. The water shimmered with unnatural energy, and then they emerged. The Watchers. Tall, shadowed figures rose from the sea, their hollow eyes gleaming like pearls lost to the abyss. Their forms shifted like the tide, neither flesh nor water, their presence a curse upon the shore. Solara stiffened in Roman's arms, her fingers clutching his shirt. "They will not stop until they take me back." Roman unsheathed his sword, the steel glinting under the moonlight. "Then let them try." The tallest of the Watchers stepped forward, his voice a deep rumble, like the groaning of the ocean floor. "You were born of the tide, Solara. You cannot sever what you are." Solara lifted her chin, though her hands trembled. "I have made my choice." "Then the ocean will take something in return." The air stilled, a silence so deep it seemed as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Solara's heart clenched. She knew the ways of the sea, the cruel balance it demanded. It did not simply lose. It claimed. And in that moment she understood. The price for her freedom would not be hers to pay. Her eyes snapped to Ronan, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. No. But before she could move, before she could stop it, a wave, dark as midnight, rose behind them. Ronan turned just in time to see it before it crashed down. The force struck like a hammer, ripping him from Solara's grasp, dragging him into the abyss. The salt water filled his lungs, stealing his breath, pulling him into the cold depths. Solara screamed, plunging after him. The water swallowed her, the current wrapping around her limbs like chains. She reached through the darkness, her hands desperate, searching. And then she found him. His body was limp, his eyes barely open. The sea was claiming him. No, not him. Tears blurred her vision as she cradled his face, her heart shattering. He had fought for her, defied the gods of the sea, and now the ocean demanded him as its price. Desperation clawed at her chest. She pressed her forehead against his, whispering words the sea could not hear, promises only the waves would remember. And then she made her final choice. With one last breath, Solara let go of everything she had been, every piece of the ocean that had bound her, and poured it all into him. A gift, a sacrifice, a farewell. And as the tide carried them back to shore, Only one of them would wait beneath the rising sun. Dawn broke with golden fingers stretching across the sky, painting the sea in hues of amber and rose. The waves lapped gently at the shore now, as if the ocean had finally quieted, its hunger sated, its anger spent. Ronan lay motionless on the sand, his body still as the tide kissed his fingertips. The wind tangled in his dark hair, carrying the scent of salt and sorrow. His chest did not rise. His lips, once warm, had turned pale. And Solara, she knelt beside him, her silver hair shimmering beneath the newborn sun, though the light in her own eyes had dimmed. The sea had taken what it wanted. She had given it everything. Her fingertips traced the curve of his jaw, the memory of his voice still lingering in her heart. He had fought for her. He had loved her beyond reason, beyond fear. And in the end, she had done the only thing she could. She had given him her breath, her life, her very essence. A mermaid who surrendered her soul to the land could never return to the sea. She had known this, and still she had chosen him. A wave curled up the shore, carrying whispers of the deep. The watchers were gone. The ocean had accepted its price. Solara leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, their skin cold where once it had burned with fire. "Come back to me," she breathed. "Please." Silence. But then, a breath, shallow, weak, but there. Ronan's chest rose, his body shuddering as air filled his lungs. A gasp escaped his lips, and his eyes, storm blue and endless, fluttered open. Solara exhaled a soft, shaking sob. He was alive. His gaze found hers, unfocused at first, as if he were still caught between this world and the next. Then understanding dawned, and his arms reached for her, pulling her close, holding her as if she might vanish. "Solara," he rasped, his voice raw, broken. She smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. He had survived, but she was no longer what she had been. Roman pulled back, searching her face. Something was different. Her skin, once kissed by the shimmer of the sea, had lost its glow. Her eyes, though still silver, no longer held the reflection of the tides. He touched her cheek, his fingers trembling. "What did you do?" She placed her hand over his, pressing it to her skin. "I gave you my breath, my life, my place in the ocean." Roman's heart twisted. The truth crashed into him like a wave against the cliffs. She had severed herself from the sea for him. He cupped her face, his grip desperate. "But now, what are you?" A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. She was no longer a daughter of the tide, no longer a creature of the depths. She was land-bound. She was his. The wind carried the scent of salt and sunrise as Roman pulled her into his arms, holding her like the most fragile treasure. "Then stay," he whispered. "Stay with me." The ocean had taken much, but for once it had given something in return. Solara tilted her face up to his, the sun painting golden streaks in her silver hair. "I already have." And as the waves continued their endless song, the pirate and the mermaid, no longer of two different worlds, stood together on the shore, bound not by the ocean, but by love that had conquered even the sea.